Pence himself did not seemingly succumb to this charm initiative. At the same time, he made comments seeming to say that the U.S. might be willing to talk to North Korea at this point. What exactly, where do things stand at this point?
Yeah, there were two things that Vice President Pence was doing. You had the very public persona where he was basically ignoring the North Koreans and trying to avoid having any contact with them while he was in South Korea for the Olympics. But behind the scenes, we now know that the White House and the Trump administration is sort of putting out feelers about having some talks with the North Koreans. And Vice President Pence said in an interview with the Washington Post on his trip back to Washington that he would be willing and that the U.S. would be willing to have some talks with the North Koreans, even as the U.S. continues to put forward this maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions and diplomatic sanctions. They're interested in having some of the talks, and now that we know that the South Koreans are interested in having talks and continuing talks beyond just the Olympics and maybe even talking about the nuclear program, it sounds like the U.S. is now on board with being a part of those talks, even though the U.S. wants to continue to isolate North Korea. They do want to explore the idea of having talks and see if they can get anywhere closer to some kind of solution.
Is President Moon of South Korea really changing our position here? Because, as you say, that Washington Post report looked to me like a change in policy for the United States. In the past, we'd had all kinds of preconditions to sitting down. Not clear we have all those preconditions anymore. Are we changing our position because of a concern that President Moon is going to sit down with Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, the U.S. has no choice but really to follow in the lead of its ally. Right now, South Korea is moving very quickly towards trying to have diplomacy with the North Koreans, sitting down at the table, trying to move very quickly towards some sort of solution to the nuclear program that does not involve war. And the U.S. is sort of following behind that, realizing that the train is already leaving the station. We can't continue to just keep the North Koreans isolated and continue sanctions and think that South Korea is going to go along with us, because President Moon campaigned on this idea of having talks with the North Koreans and solving this issue diplomatically, and he's fulfilling his campaign promise and having them come to South Korea. Now he's received an invitation to visit North Korea, and it sounds like he's going to follow through on that invitation, maybe even this year go to Pyongyang. And if the U.S. continues to sit on the sideline, it would seem like we're being left behind. So that's part of the reason you're seeing this sort of shift in position from the U.S. saying, yes, we want to continue sanctions, but we also will consider talks and consider having some diplomacy and even sitting down at the table with the North Koreans without preconditions. Definitely a shift from where we've been in the past.
And Tolu, you were there with the president. I mean, it's so interesting to me that this closed kingdom, that now the media, the exposure that it's getting and what face it's putting forward are getting a little bit more of a positive reception. We saw the North Korean cheerleaders. We saw Kim Jong-un's sister there at the Olympic Games. What effect does that kind of publicity have, if any, then on policy?
Well, Vice President Pence specifically went to South Korea in part because he wanted to combat that narrative. He did not want the North Koreans to hijack the games. That's why he brought the father of an American citizen who died after being in captivity in North Korea. He met with North Korean defectors. He visited the remains of a ship that had been torpedoed, allegedly by the North Koreans. But it does seem like the positive media campaign of the North Koreans was able to overshadow everything that the vice president was trying to do. And I think that's part of the reason you see the U.S. realizing that it's time to sort of shift policy, and instead of continuing to try to just isolate North Korea diplomatically, figuring out a way to move towards talks and see if there's a way to solve the North Korean nuclear problem through diplomacy and not just through the military option that the president and the vice president continue to say is on the table. But definitely the South Koreans don't want, and all parties for the most part do not want, the military option to be the option that we end up resorting to.